Good afternoon, and thank you, Bruce, for the introduction. When preparing this presentation, I was trying to put myself into your position. What would be my expectation for my career progression that has already been impacted by the coronavirus, and yet it is quite probable that there is nothing to compare it with the impact of superintelligence. How should I adapt to that new working environment, I would ask myself, in which it may be even more difficult than ever before to find my first job, but where I may also have to change my profession several times in my lifetime? Even those who are already working must have similar questions, I have thought. I hope that my lecture will be a kind of a guidance on how to adapt to that new environment and be more resilient to negative aspects of life in such a turbulent world, especially if you see the light at the end of the tunnel leading to the world of, wait for it, unimaginable abundance. There is a problem, however. We will have to go through a period of transition to the time when we will be coexisting with superintelligence. And that has been the quest of Sustensis, which has been focusing for the last 10 years on promoting ideas and inspirations for humanity's transition to coexistence with superintelligence. My own quest motivated me several years ago to write a book on that subject. Who could save humanity from superintelligence? That book was primarily about existential risk that we are facing, among which superintelligence is the most formidable to conquer. So what would be the agenda for today, you may ask yourself? Well, the first thing that I would like to explain is what is superintelligence and how to make it human-friendly. That would be followed by how may superintelligence impact your work and your life, especially in the near to medium term, that means in this decade, and in the long term, over 10 years. And the third point that I would like to raise is how should you prepare now, right now, for these new challenges. So don't wait till 2050, start preparing right now. So let me first begin with what is intelligence, AI, and superintelligence. I would define intelligence as the ability to learn and apply AI knowledge to change the environment most effectively. That is the ability to evaluate and judge and quickly learn from experience. And you may think, wow, this is what the animals do. And you're right, animals and birds, for instance. But to have abstract thoughts and the ability to reason, comprehend complex ideas, and to have the capacity for original thought is the domain of humans. Most people, I would say, think that AI is simply an upgraded form of IT. Well, I'm afraid it's not so, because in information technology, we really deal with processing of information based on strict, uniquely defined rules and data coming through defined channels. In AI, or artificial intelligence, we are dealing with problem solving through learning and self-learning, as well as discovery based on sometimes very incomplete information. And it's the process of learning that makes the AI so distinct from information technology. So what is then superintelligence? Well, Initially, I would say there could be, within the next decade, within this decade, there can be a number of quasi-superintelligences, immature as they may be, competing to conquer the world. So we may have a kind of cyber wars. But ultimately, there will be just one single digital thinking entity far exceeding all human intelligence. I'll go even further, saying that its intelligence will improve exponentially to reach in weeks a point which is known as technological singularity. When we reach that point, humans will not be able to control it or even understand its actions and decisions. You may then think, okay, this is superintelligence, but would I be able to touch it? Will I be able to embrace it? So what is it made of, if you like? Well, the components of superintelligence can be compared to the constituents of a human body. Essentially what we have a body, yes, we all agree, and so does the superintelligence. Its body is data, processes, memory, interface nodes of superintelligence, the communications, satellite including, sensors and neurons. So that's the body. That is also our body. And like human, superintelligence will have its own mind, a single entity. And what is that? That will involve cognition and, of course, intelligence. But there is one extra thing that is only an attribute of humans. What is it? An idea? Yes, you're right. It's consciousness. Now, the second question is, you may ask yourself how it will be represented. Very briefly and crudely, we may already see or feel that superintelligence today. If you imagine Internet ++ and Google ++++, if you combine together, you will have the approximation of what superintelligence may look like. It may be represented simultaneously in various forms in various parts of the globe by human-like robots, like for instance Jaya, most human-like of all robots, Sophia, most intelligent humanoid, which has citizenship of Saudi Arabia, believe it or not. And then we have one of the most emotional humanoid called Mark, which surprisingly is a lady. And we have other scientific humanoid robots like Einstein and Han. But we also have, quite recently, avatars. Not the cartoon avatars, but avatars that behave almost exactly and look almost exactly as the original. So this is the original person, and this is his avatar. And he behaves, he has emotional expression exactly the same as the original. But superintelligence may also be represented in the future by holograms. And finally, transhumans, conscious transhumans. So people which will have embedded external facilities, hardware, usually chips in the brain, like the Neuralink chip that was presented in August, and will communicate via Wi-Fi with the external world. And that is our hope, that transhumans really will represent superintelligence. Now, the question is when we may have a mature superintelligence. Before I answer that question, we have to acknowledge, and we better do it as quickly as we can, although it's difficult to absorb it, that the pace of change is becoming nearly exponential. If anyone wants to visualize what it means is, let me do this very quick comparison. If I make 31 meter linear steps, I would make 30 meters. But if I make 30 exponential steps, then I would have covered over 1 million kilometers, circling the globe 26 times. We are now, as this coronavirus probably has indicated to many of us, at this point, which is called the knee curve of exponential change. From now on, the small steps, accelerating a little bit, will become even bigger and even steeper. So what we are seeing now is just the very, very beginning of exponential change taking place. Examples, this Microsoft Teams video conferencing, Zoom, processor speed, genome sequencing, which is much faster than exponential, biomeat production, which is even faster than exponential, autonomous driving, knowledge acquisition, and so on. Well, I think it would be worthwhile for you to take away from this presentation just one message, that what now takes a year to achieve, in 10 years' time, at the end of this decade, would take just a week. So this gives us a background to assess whether what I will show you in a second, in the next slide, is real or not, or can be made real. The question is, will we have a mature superintelligence by 2050? Mr. Ray Kurzweil, one of the best-known futurists, who's made 147 predictions since 1990 with 86% accuracy, believes that we will achieve superintelligence by 2045. I am perhaps more cautious and less optimistic, and I opt for 2050. Now, this prediction was made in 2017. In that time, what happened is that we have suddenly got quantum computing to such an extent that today you can hook on to IBM website and connect to quantum computing facility and do quantum computing calculations right now. These are still the early days, but this is the application of quantum computing. 3 years ago, people, experts, didn't think that it would happen at all. So this is what exponential pace of change means. And with quantum computing, achieving superintelligence by 2050 seems even more probable. Now, if you think that you can hold this process, or if you wanted to stop the superintelligence being created or developed and so on, forget it. It's impossible. I give you one question. Are you able to stop global internet right now? The answer is you can't. You think that you can turn off the switch. I don't want to go into details because I'm constrained by the time and it's not the main subject of it. But believe me or not, unless we want a civilizational collapse, you can't stop global internet, nor will we be able to stop the creation of superintelligence. So, assuming that we have that superintelligence by 2050, there is no guarantee that it will be a friendly one. I would go even further. There is even no guarantee that humans will still be around by the end of this century. Surprised? Why not? Wow. Since 1945, we have lived in the age of man-made existential risks. Until then, all existential risks like pandemics, earthquakes, asteroid impact, and so on, were all natural. Since 1945, we have existential risk threats created by man himself. You may ask, what are they? Is coronavirus one of them? No. In my view, it's a vaccination for humanity. It actually prepares us for much stronger response and more difficult challenges, such as climate change, which, yes, it is an existential threat, and it is man-made, as we know now, it's anthropogenic. But if it were only that, how about artificial intelligence? Spot on. But there are more. There is a list of at least 9 such existential risks, all man-made, of which artificial intelligence or superintelligence is rated between 5 to 15% by the end of this century to make us extinct. If you add all those man-made existential risks together, you arrive at a point where it is calculated that we will have the risk of 20 to 50% of being extinct by 2100. What is worth to note that by 2030, we may already lose control over AI. This is a tipping point for AI. But coincidentally, it is also the tipping point for the climate change. So if these two are not somehow tamed or constrained, by then we may be really in trouble in just 10 years' time. And by 2050, we may be in the hands of superintelligence, hopefully a benevolent one. But on top of that, we no longer live in normal times. Even Mr. Johnson said that from now on, this, what you see, is a new normal. Yes, coronavirus is not an existential risk as such, but if it is combined with other man-made risks, then it may become an existential risk. And I give you some examples. So let's say this is a coronavirus risk, which is, as you may already see, combined with long financial crisis that we have never seen. We haven't even started feeling it, but it's just around the corner. And technological unemployment that has already been advanced by 5 to 7 years. It would have happened anyway, but coronavirus has just made it coming much earlier. And then cyber wars like the one between Iran and Saudi Arabia last year, the local military conflict, Ukraine, Baltics, nuclear wars, cosmic battleground. Just earlier this week, United States said that NASA will be preparing a permanent base on the moon from 2024, so in 4 years' time. So what do you think the Chinese or the Russians will say about that? Severe drought and hunger causing massive migration. If all of these, or even some of these, are combined, we may be in real trouble. And on top of that, we may have immature superintelligence. I say immature in various forms, not just like a Terminator, but in more sophisticated forms by the end of this decade, which makes really us think, how can we manage humanity's survival over this decade, not to mention the next decade? So there is, of course, a question now, what can we do to create a friendly superintelligence that would not only stop being risk for our extinction, but would help us to extinguish the fires and combat the other existing risks. I think we need to do it in 3 domains simultaneously. The first one is to change focus from a national to a planetary view. You may remember 4 years ago, the American elections. And I would say people are often divided by us versus them. I mean, this story continues. What we see between Biden and Trump today is just a repeat, but it's even worse than anybody could have had imagined. But soon, we may have to be united as us against what? Against it. It's not IT, it's it, superintelligence. So the only way that I would see out of that is having a planetary view and create what I would call a human federation. And that prompted me to write my second book several years ago, Federate to Survive, which was the first in this post-human series. So the second domain that we need to attack, if you like, is to reform democracy. I mean, deep reform of democracy. We need a new model of democracy, such as consensual presidential democracy that I presented in my third book. And it actually consists of 4 pillars: balance, rights, and responsibilities. If you think about coronavirus right now, if you hear the people saying, I am free to roam around in the park, and if I infect anybody else, so what? This is my freedom. But if you take this approach, consequently, then obviously it would mean that everybody is for himself. It will be almost like in primitive stages, when we were foraging and people were fighting with crude weapons for their own little area of freedom. This is no longer possible. The gun control in America is an evidence of how mistakenly the concept of freedom is being perceived. That isn't seen as a shared freedom where we have to compromise and so on. So we have to be responsible, and we have to balance our rights and responsibilities. And the second area is the political consensus, modeled more or less on the Scandinavian countries, where the president has significant powers, enabling him to act very, very quickly, like in the current pandemic. Look at what the French president does. Doesn't mean that he is a dictator, because he is extremely strongly controlled, even much stronger than now in France. But he is above the political divide. He's a true representative of the nation. And then we need shallow federalization. Let's follow on from the previous one. Not a dictator or Soviet Union. We need something that unites the people around certain key goals, but gives even more freedom to the lowest possible level of government as possible. And finally, you will have to take account and blessing, essentially, of AI-assisted governance on an unimaginable scale. And that will be seen and felt mostly benevolently within the next few years. I've covered all that in my third book, the second in the post-human series, Democracy for a Human Federation. And the third domain is to maintain control over maturing AI. And this can be done in 3 areas. The first one is in the area of values, universal values of humanities, as a kind of a AI's ethics code and a guidance to human preferences. The second one is the area of rearing AI as a child in the real environment among people at home, school, and workplace. And the final one is to collect AI experience in human preferences and in value judgment and sharing it with other AI agents. Like, for instance, here, Sophia the robot is in the court representing a victim. In the office, at the factory, at the laboratories. If you know anything about the Tesla cars, then you probably have heard about collecting unusual experiences by the Tesla vehicles being collected, analyzed by AI agents, and then deployed, that enhanced knowledge and experience being deployed to all Tesla cars. And this is happening, this has been happening for at least maybe even 2 years on a daily basis. And if we extend it beyond the automotive industry, this will happen to most of advanced AI agents. So all these experiences will be collected, as I say, by a maturing superintelligence. I covered that subject in my final book in the Posthuman series, released this year, Becoming a Butterfly. So you and I have two big questions. The first one is, since we are unfortunately living in this almost lockdown stage, COVID-19, how it may impact my career. So this is a near to medium term view. And then you may have the second question, how may superintelligence impact my career? So this is a long-term view. And to summarize it, I would say that, putting into a nutshell, that coronavirus accelerated civilization change by several years, especially an area arrival of technological unemployment. And the second one is that superintelligence will be essentially impacting us in 3 stages. The first one is the decade of what I call immature superintelligence. It will be very, very tough, unfortunately. Next decade could be quite good, but by about 2050, if we survive relatively unscathed, you reach the world of unimaginable abundance. So let's now consider the near to medium term view and the impact of technological unemployment. What will matter most in you remaining in employment, and how you can make your career progression in this decade? I will start by going back to 1945, essentially the end of the Second World War, and showing you this graph depicting the US productivity and employment over 70 years. As you can see, the productivity and employment was growing, but productivity was growing faster than employment. Since around 10 years' time, the gap has been rising almost exponentially, and this doesn't include this coronavirus. We will have fantastic boost in productivity, which will be caused by creation of a critical mass with robotization. So this is a mixed blessing. First of all, it's a very bad news. Why it is a very bad news? Well, there is a futurist called Thomas Frey, very well known as well, who as well, I mean, in comparison to Ray Kurzweil, who estimates that by 2030, half of the world's jobs may be gone and over 100 job types may disappear. Assuming there will be 3.5 to 4 billion jobs at that time, that means that about 1 billion people may become permanently unemployed. Well, McKinsey doesn't share totally his view. They are a little bit more optimistic, if you like. It's almost a sardonistic expression, saying that they expect only 400 to 800 million people losing their jobs permanently. I emphasize permanently by 2030. That means these people will not be employable, even because they won't be able to change to any new skills. Thomas Frey has compiled over 100 jobs that will most likely disappear by 2030. I have rearranged it into a kind of a table so it is more clearly visible which new technologies will have impact on which professions. Like, for instance, driverless cars obviously will have impact on drivers, taxi drivers, limo drivers, bus drivers, truck drivers, mail carriers. And then if you go into say robots, in the retail sector, you have retail clerks, check clerks. You can see it right now. Imagine or take into account that by 2030, 10% of neurosurgeons will only be needed to do the work that they do right now, 10% of accountants, and 10% of the lawyers. This is really a very upsetting news. Not that the people will be without work and perhaps means to survive, but also, as Voltaire once said, that work saves a man from 3 great evils. What is it? It's boredom, vice, and need. Now, you may feel very, very unhappy and unpleasant, feel it's an unpleasant situation, and you may ask, almost shout out, can anybody help me? Well, over 4 years ago, I developed with, and then tried to get support from UCL, kind of a methodology with a full specification for a kind of an app which I called METIS Life Mentor. Nothing happened. As you realize, universities don't take yet into account exponential change, and neither did UCL, though we made quite a good progress. It is pointless because we are going to have almost identical tools, perhaps not yet as sophisticated as this idea, but coming very soon, like this Samsung Nano. You just remember the name, Nano, which may come in January next year, the first version, which will do something similar to what I am showing you right now. So my point of departure was that each of us has an inner world, and that is based on values that are very dear to us, and essentially they tell myself and others who I am. So who are you? What's your life about? Your life goals, objectives, and tasks, and also your strengths and weaknesses. What are you capable of? And finally, about your preferences, what you like or what you dislike. So this is your inner world. And then we have to interact with the outer world. And in that outer cold world, we are lost because it is changing at, you got it, exponential pace. So I invented that METIS Life Mentor, which essentially through the so-called METIS inference engine, interviews you in minute detail, knowing you at the end of those interviews better than you know it yourself, about your events, opportunities, and threats, about what you like and dislike in your life. What is your ultimate life goals, day by day, hour by hour. So it would advise people on how to live their life more effectively and consistently. If you think that this is a fantasy, think about the coronavirus application that has been downloaded to now perhaps 15 million people within days, right? If such a thing like nano, this will, yes, exponentially accelerate, and within a few years we'll have something like that. So what are the other solutions to minimize the negative impact of technological unemployment in the labor market? First of all, we would need to increase the living wage. And this has been happening in the UK to some degree. We need to cut down working hours. This will happen, in my view, perhaps even next year, as flexible retirement age will, and the redesigning jobs for sharing, which has happened in disguise, like giving the employer a chance to keep 2 employees, each cutting down their own wage, but at least having a job. And that is already happening. And then we need universal basic income or negative income tax, and by what I mean unconditional. And I'll be talking about this in a minute. In the near term, from the UK perspective, paradoxically, we are in a quite privileged position, essentially accidentally. You remember Ian Hampton-Smith? I'm not a great fan of him, but where praise is due, I will give it. It was he who has introduced the universal credit. And obviously, even a year ago, people were scrolling down and saying, this is a very difficult concept to implement. And it was implemented. And if we didn't have it, the furlough scheme wouldn't be possible to implement, and went really, really smoothly. So this is really good news. So universal credit could be adapted as a negative income tax, because there's nothing else like a tax credit. Since we already get £2,500 tax-free in tax allowance, if we increase it to say £3,000 and extend it not just to those people who are employed, but to everyone, including children proportionally, then everybody would get around £250 per month. Obviously, all the everything above that would be taxable. A recent retraining scheme announced by Boris Johnson, £1.5 billion for anybody. 4-day working week, we are almost there. Job sharing on a gigantic scale, as I mentioned, and early retirement. So what is the long-term view, 2030 onwards? What will be the direct impact of AI and superintelligence? And from your perspective, how it will impact your employment and your career progression? And here we have plenty of good news. The most important one is that the GDP will rise faster than most economist organizations, including OECD, IMF, World Bank, predict 2.5 to 3.5%. McKinsey in October 2018 published a report when it estimates that there will be 1.2 additional GDP growth annually by 2030. What it would mean roughly that by the end of the decade, the GDP worldwide will not rise, say, by 50%, but will be double that amount. And that is a very good news, because that's how we will be able to pay for those who can't work. The other good news is that there will be over 160 new skills needed by the of 2030. And this is another set of data prepared by Thomas Frey, which I have rearranged and showing you which new industries will be created and which new job types. And you can all, if you want to know the details, look into the presentation that will be available on the Sustensis site. The benefits of superintelligence will be multi-dimensional, I would say. We will be living in the world of abundance. So we have the super welfare state 2.0, as I would say Beveridge 2.0. We have regenerative medicine, new democracy, no wars, new politics. We will have to have. If we survive, then there won't be any other means. We will be under the guidance of superintelligence, don't forget that. Education and self-fulfillment will reach unimaginable level. Global wealth redistribution fund, about which I was writing extensively in my first book, so that we will spread the wealth, not like it is today, that 1% of the world's population owns half of the world's wealth. And then we'll perhaps go not just to the moon, but to Mars, as Elon Musk wants to send 1 million of us by 2050. And if you consider how many of his claims proved to be right and achieved, then you may take it seriously. So how will we pay for all this? After all, there may be 1 to 2 billion people unemployed. The first thing is that there will be exponential growth of productivity, that I said, and the smart robots and taxes on that will pay for that. Coronavirus has really created a new massive robotization. So that's because there is, if you like, a critical mass. Before, it was unwise to invest in robots in a big way because you didn't know whether the market would be there. Now we know the market is there. Demonetization of service and goods like smartphones. Do you know that you are a millionaire? If you were living in at the end of the 80s, early 90s, what you have now on your mobile phone, like video conferencing, would cost you $250,000 per hour. It's all now on your phone, including GPS and so on, worth at least $1 million. And what I haven't added to that, because that's the data from 2012, is the ability that you can have your own TV channel, also free. And TV channel in 1990 would cost you billions. Yes, when Yahoo was created, the YouTube was created, we are talking billions, and it was 2004. So we will have cheaper government thanks to large-scale AI systems such as Super Watson, Super Alexa, and we will have lower budget for education, defense, and perhaps even for health. So how can society adapt to the new work and lifestyle? I would start with the government, and I showed you that curve, the exponential pace of change. And this is why we need visionary governance, we need openness and conciliatory approach to people. And we need welfare state, but not one that gives a fishing rod, a basket full of fish, but rather a fishing rod. So we need to promote education and training, no easy handouts. Remember Voltaire, work, save us from boredom, greed, and needs. Primary education. This will change beyond, and has to change beyond belief. Teachers will be needed more than ever, but primarily to adapt, to teach children how to adapt to life changing exponentially, and the numeracy and literacy will be delivered by AI assistants. In academic and secondary school and academic education, the role of such sites like Khan Academy, where you can have 2,000 different subjects studied up to the level of PhD, there will be the key guidance. They will provide the key education, including also the AI assistants such as Watson, who you may remember in 2012 won the Jeopardy game, winning $1 million. We would need interdisciplinary knowledge and extra curriculum. Employers and trade association, they will have to support multi-skilling and continuous adaptation to changing work conditions. What it would mean is that when an employee may be potentially seen as being redundant, say half a year earlier, the company that he works in should prepare for his redundancy and his retraining, and that should be supported by the government. In some European countries, that has been happening for many, many years, not unfortunately in Britain. We need ethical organizations that will promote coexistence, mutual help, and diversity. And finally, we need to think about our own lives supported by the latest technology, such as personal mentors, which will, or in the style of METIS Life Mentor, which will help to make us sane, essentially, and to retain some resemblance of sanity, and to help us in career progression. Now, regarding yourself, I think you need to be entrepreneurial, first of all, then creative and innovative, show some kind of leadership skills, and have system thinking, by which I mean people need to see the detail and the whole, and you need to be good at problem solving. Yes, being technology savvy, which is absolutely fundamental, and be prepared, be adaptive to exponential pace of change. And finally, you need to be very good at interpersonal skills, including robots, because there will be teams including robots. So let me summarize what we've been talking about today. First of all, what we need to do is, it's the government and us, we need to adapt to exponential pace of change. This is very difficult because it's nothing to do with skills, it's to do with our character and our genome, almost. And I don't know myself whether we'll be sufficiently resilient as a species to adapt to something like that. I don't think that any species is able to do that in nature. We are a thinking, conscious species, and maybe we're able to do that. Technology may be about 100 times more efficient in 2030. This is very good news. Global GDP will double. There will be 100 job types that disappear and 500 million world permanently unemployed. But we will have to give a helping hand in the form of unconditional EBI or negative income tax, and this should be a top priority. Over 100 new job types will be created, and people will change their profession several times in their lifetime. In order to assist that, we need multidisciplinary education and a wider curriculum, making essential at schools. So the school program has to change dynamically, almost on a yearly basis. So production of manuals may not be a wise thing, because before they are printed out, they may already be out of date. The teacher's role would change fundamentally, and must change fundamentally with the arrival of AI assistants. That will be probably more important than ever, but in slightly different roles. And finally, creativity and entrepreneurism, plus adaptability to change, will be the most desired skills that you have. Now, before I open the question and answer session, just a little bit about the fish and the fishing rod. I could, if it's obviously a metaphor, I could have sent you out my 4 books as a kind of appreciation that you've attended the presentation. But I thought it is better to give you a fishing rod, because if you are really interested, you would probably go to the Sustensis website where you can download the presentation. But if you search it, you'll find a tab somewhere which will lead you to downloading all those 4 books as PDF downloads. And I wish you a good search. Thank you very much.